Hello everyone and welcome to the penultimate round of the Altibox Norway Championship, where we again have a game that fits well in our series Battle for the Future, where young Alireza Firouzja will be taking on world champion Magnus Carlsen in a classical game, and then of course if the classical game ends in a draw, they will play an Armageddon game. So without further ado, let's check it out. In the first round of the Altibox Norway Championship, where Magnus had the white pieces, their classical game was drawn, but then Magnus was able to win the Armageddon game. And now Alireza has a chance to retaliate and maybe to catch up, as they're very close. These are the standings currently. And as you can see, Alireza is only a point behind Magnus, so a win in the classical would get him extremely close to winning the entire event. So let's see how it goes. Alireza with the white pieces opens with knight to f3. We have the Reti on the board, we have knight to f6, g3 and c5. We have bishop to g2 and now knight to c6 by Magnus. We have castles and now e5. So grabbing hold of the center, gaining control of the d4 square. We have e4, not really giving up a pawn, because if you capture on e4, you just get rook to e1, and then, well, you have to move the knight, then you lose on e5. You could even play d4 and play some attractive chess. All in all, this is something you don't do. So here d6 defending, and now c3. And again, it seems like you could capture here, but your king is still in the center of the board. You just don't want to go for material. And this looks like something that would definitely favor young Alireza, as he prepared for this for a classical game, of course. So instead, we have g6 by Magnus, and it is already as of move 6 that we have a completely new game. So which is I mean, for a classical chess, new game already as of move 6 is pretty insane. So okay, we have d4 by Alireza, striking in the center. Magnus still needs at least 2 more moves to castle his king to safety. We have c captures on d4, c captures, and bishop to g4. Putting pressure on the center, the knight is pinned, so of course grabbing the pawn is the threat here. So d captures on e5, we have d captures on e5 and knight to c3. Alireza continues development. We have bishop to g7 and now h3. Asking, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back? Do you want to capture on f3? Magnus captures, and now before recapturing, Alireza trades queen. So we have queen captures on d8, rook captures on d8, and now bishop captures on f3. And now Magnus just castles to safety. And we have this position where the material on the board is completely equal, and the position on the board is also very, very equalish, as you can see, very similar. Main difference is Alireza still has the bishop pair and Magnus doesn't. So here, king to g2, improving the position of the king, and knight to d4. Magnus grabs this excellent outpost for his knight, but Firouzja will also grab the d5 square for his knight, which means that he first needs to pin the knight, grab the knight, and then secure the d5 square for his own knight. So h6 here by Magnus, and now bishop captures on f6. We have bishop captures and the knight to d5. So both players with excellent outputs for their monster knights, and now, while you could play king to g7, if you go king to g7, then do we have like an identical position. Rook to d1 is missing for the position to be perfectly symmetrical, but Magnus doesn't go for that. Instead, he goes rook to d6, which defends the bishop, but also allows him to have some mobility with the rook. You could bring the rook to a6, maybe attack the pawn later on. You could bring this rook to d8, the c8. Seems just like a more flexible idea. So here Alireza goes rook a to c1, brings his rook to an open c file, which Magnus couldn't do right away because, well, his bishop was hanging. He needed to tend to that, and now bishop back to d8, controlling the knight and getting rid of the target. We have rook f to d1 by Alireza, and now king to g7 by Magnus, and now knight back to e3. So as you can see, very solid position for both players. And now rook to a6. Magnus now attacks the a2 pawn, as it is a target, so Alireza forced to deal with it. We have a3, and now h5 by Magnus, grabbing more space on the king's side. We have knight to c4, putting pressure on the e5 pawn, and now bishop back to f6 for the moment. Looks like a weird square for the bishop, but the knight isn't all that impressive on c4. So Magnus says, when you move your knight from c4, I'm going to move my weird bishop from f6. So here, h4 by Alireza, also just closes forces up the position on the king side, and now rook to c8, getting the other rook to the open c file. We have knight back to e3. Now Alireza offers a trade of a pair of rooks, and Magnus says, not a problem, but we will do it under my terms. So rook 8 to c6 now, for threatening to win material here, so the exchange will happen on c6. So we have rook captures on c6, rook captures on c6, and now rook to d3. Here Alireza says, okay, I'm going to play rook to c3. Either I'm going to get a lot of activity for my rook, or we're going to just trade rooks, and well, I'm pretty sure I can draw this. I mean, equal material, 4 pawns on the king side each, 2 pawns on the queen side each, and a bishop and a knight each. So bishop back to d8 by Magnus. Now he can shift the bishop over to b6 if needed, or to a5 even, and bishop back to d1. We have rook to c1 by Magnus, now that Alireza allowed it, but bishop to b3. So not really much happening there. Alireza keeping this rook at bay. Not really a lot you can do with this rook. Like, you could go rook to b1, but then knight to c4 comes, and you're defending the pawn, but you don't really have b5 since this pawn is hanging, and then you have to defend this, for example, with f6, and then rook to d1 just forces a rook trade, which is what Magnus wants to avoid. So instead, after this bishop to b3 move, Magnus just goes b5. And here you can see that Alireza doesn't really have all that many moves he can play. But even worse than that, he's very low on time. Magnus is like an hour and 20 minutes, and I think I checked the game at around this point, and Alireza was around 12 minutes, I believe, on the clock. So he does have to play precise. So he plays rook to d1. He says, I want to trade rooks, just get the rook out of the way. Magnus retreats, rook to c8. He wants to, live the fight another day, and now bishop back to a2, getting rid of this pressure, and he might be interested in remaneuvering the bishop to b1 if needed later. We have a5 by Magnus, grabbing more space on the queen side, and now rook to d3. Again, Alireza with the same idea. He wants to play rook c3, trade off the last pair of rooks, and play this endgame. We have a4 by Magnus, just grabbing even more space on the queen side, and king f1. Alireza says now it's time to start bringing the king into the game. We have bishop to b6. The bishop will be excellent on this diagonal here. And now you could play a waiting move like bishop to d5. You could play rook to d2, also a nice waiting move, as black now does have some control of the c2 square, so we might want to play that. However, Alireza sticks, well, not that, but he sticks with his plan and goes rook to c3. Offers a rook trade, and Magnus very, very happily obliges here. So rook captures on c3. B captures, now attacking Carlsen's knight here, and the knight to b3. And you definitely don't want to capture this. It seems like you can capture it, double black's pawns, and also stop the pass pawns. For example, knight d1 covers this, but bishop to c5 is just a huge problem for white. For example, king e2, you're just going to capture here, and now after king to d2, you will not be able to approach any of this, and you've just given up too much. This is completely lost. f5 is coming. Black will start to bring the king into the game, and that will be over. So here, after knight to b3, we have king to e1. Alireza brings the king even closer into the game, and now bishop to c5. So it's a problem, as these pawns are now on dark squares, but Alireza says it's not a problem since your pawns are on light squares, and I have a light square bishop. So here, knight to c2, Alireza defends it, and now knight to c1. And now the bishop is under attack, but also the f2 pawn is under attack, and knight to d3 check is coming. So while you tend to the bishop, you will lose the f2 pawn. So by this little maneuver, Magnus is able in winning the f2 pawn. So Alireza has to move the bishop to d5, and now knight to d3 with check. King to e2, and now knight captures an f2. So Magnus has won a pawn, but is it enough in such an equal endgame? And he will start losing the light square pawns on the queen side. So bishop to c6, Alireza now goes after the queen side pawns, and f6 defends the e5 pawn, and also now the king can start coming into the game. We have knight to e3. Now the bishop no longer guards the knight, and and Alireza wants to get rid of the knight. So here, knight to h1. If you capture this, then it's a big problem for Magnus. For example, king captures here, and now even after, let's say, check king f3, now these pawns are falling, and then you have to worry about these two pawns, which would be winning for white. So instead, after this knight to e3 move, we have knight to h1 by Magnus. A very weird square for the knight, but you are attacking the g3 pawn. So here, knight to f1, getting the knight out of harm's way while also defending the g3 pawn. And now bishop captures on a3 by Magnus. Bishop captures on b5, and now bishop to b2. Here Magnus says, do you want to advance your pawn? Because if you advance, I'm going to advance my pawn as well. And, well, your c4 pawn is now blocking your bishop from guarding the a2 square. So, of course, Alireza instead trades with bishop captures and bishop captures on c3. And now we have this position where it's a bishop and knight, 4 pawns Magnus versus 3 pawns Alireza. King to f3, trying to trap that knight, of course, on h1, but now bishop to d4. Of course, you need to secure the f2 square for the knight's retreat. We have g4, and now h captures on g4. King captures, and now knight to f2 check. Magnus gets his knight back into the game. King f3, and now king to h6. So Magnus doesn't go the other way around, as this would take quite some time. He wants to go here via the king side, and he will now start to advance his king. We have knight to g3, not allowing king h5, and knight to d3 now. We have bishop to e8, and now comes knight to f4. So it's not easy to make progress with black, but Magnus is banking on the fact that he has infinite time, and Alireza has been playing on increment for quite a long time now. So here, knight to e2. Magnus, of course, Alireza wants to trade knights. He wants to play an opposite colored bishop endgame where being up a pawn is nothing. So here, Magnus, of course, declines this. Knight to e6. He says, we will play on. It's much too early to draw this. Bishop to f7, attacking the knight here, and now knight to c5, just getting the knight out of the way. Knight to g3, and now bishop to c3. So still just, waiting to see what happens. And here Alireza pushes h5. He says, okay, now I'm going to capture here, or you advance this, and then I have a nice pass pawn here if you play g5. But also g5 just, runs into bishop to g6. Then you have to worry about knight f5 ideas. And, it's worst in positions like these to get checkmated. So here, bishop to e1, just threatening to pick up the knight and then win this pawn here. And Alireza just trades. Bishop captures on g6. We have bishop captures on g3, king captures, and king to g5. So Magnus gave back the pawn, and he improved the position of his king a little bit, but all in all, there is not much to look for here. But Magnus never gives anyone a draw. If you want to draw against Magnus, you will have to play it out until the very bare naked kings. So king to f3, and Magnus goes knight to b3. We have bishop to f7, attacking the knight d4 check. We have king to g3, and now knight to e2 with check. King f3, and now knight to f4. Magnus, of course, waiting for any chance here. The h5 pawn is weak, and he will, of course, win it now. King to g3, and knight captures on h5. So the pawn was, in fact, a temporary giving back of the pawn. We have bishop captures, king captures, and king to h3. And here we have a basic king and pawn endgame where you basically need to keep the opposition to keep the black king at bay. And if you've ever had a situation like this, or if you've ever studied the endgame, you of course know what we're talking about here. But Magnus still says, even though this is a dead draw, I'm still gonna try and play it out. So king h6. King h4, Alireza keeping the black king at bay, keeping the opposition. We have king to g7, and now king to g3, keeping the opposition. This is the long opposition, because if you go for something like king to g4, you break the opposition and you allow Magnus to gain the opposition, and now you're just dead lost. For example, king f3, you're gonna go king h5, king g3, king g5, again black gains the opposition, king f3, king h4, and now, again, there's not much to do here. King g4, you will slowly but surely make your way towards this pawn. So here instead king g3, Alireza goes for the long opposition, and Magnus says, all right, you know what you're doing, but we're still not gonna draw just yet. We're still gonna try and go the other way around because, okay, you know the long opposition on the king side. Do you know the long opposition on the queen side? So king f8, we have king to f2. Sorry, that's not an f2. King to f2, king to e7, we have king to e2, and now king to e8 by Magnus. Again, king to e3, king to d7 by Magnus, and the king to d3. We have king to d6, and here, here, pause the video. Well, feel free to pause the video and try to find the only not losing move for Alireza while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting again the long opposition with king to d2. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, yes, it is king to d2. You keep the long opposition and you keep the opposition whatever Magnus tries, king c5, king c3, and so on. However, now you'll see something that happens when you're defending for a long time, and you're defending against not just anyone, but against Magnus Carlsen, who is the world champion, probably the best chess player who ever played the game. And you don't play king to d2, but instead you play king to c3. And now what you've allowed Magnus to do is you've allowed him to gain the opposition, which is what Magnus played, king to c5, and it was in this position that Alireza Firouzja resigned the game. And it's amazing, yeah, this is a classical game. Alireza played quite a lot of the game on the increment, and you only get the increment after move 40. But still, this just shows you that you always have to grind it out until the end, and it doesn't matter if it's a draw. But if you know what you're doing, you always have to grind it out, and things will happen. And here it happened. Here Alireza lost the game, and Magnus just won. So here what happens is white will of course run out of squares to keep the opposition. For example, king d3. Now black gains momentum. King b4, you're gonna go, let's say, king d2. King's gonna go in, king to c4, you're gonna go king e3, king c3, again grabbing the opposition. King e2, you're gonna go king d4, and finally after king to f3 and king d3, the final opposition, white is out of squares to keep defending the pawn. You're gonna have to move, and the pawn will be lost, and now of course with 2 pawns it's an easy victory. So yeah, after this king to c5 move, Alireza resigned and Magnus won the game. And not just the game, but as Alireza was the only one who could pretty much catch up to Magnus, Magnus now wins the entire event, the Altibox Norway Championship, one whole round before the event is finished. So this is a king and pawn, 2 pawns against 1. How to hold this? These are basics of chess. But you know what really happened is it was time trouble and having Magnus Carlsen as your opponent, and this of course is good enough to take anyone down. But just another example, if you're the side that's pushing, you always need to push, and you always need to hope that your opponent will not play the absolute perfect game, and you will be able to grab full 3 points like Magnus did here. So yeah. That's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. Really amazing stuff. Just I did not believe that when this happened, but this just shows you that if it can happen to a player like Alireza, be sure it can happen to your opponent when you're playing online. If you're 1500, if you're 1700, 1900, 2100, 2300, it can happen to everyone, and you always just have to play it out until the end, and always hope for the best. So yeah, Magnus wins the game, he wins the entire event, and he wins yet another game in their series battle for the future, so we'll see what happens in the next one. I would like to thank Bernard Königsberg, Juan Vicente Alvarez, Ferhad Meki, the Judge William, and Shivbi Danda for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon. Continuing the coverage of the Altibox Norway Championship, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.